Why am I here, crowded in with all these other people, in this faceless apparatus of roadworks and supermarkets and light pollution? I could be somewhere over there, or maybe over there. It's nice over there, and it looks like there's lots of space. Why am I not over there? Why do I live in a big city? Why do you probably statistically live in a big city? Well, despite the roadworks and the light pollution, I do actually like it here. I like activities and concerts and strange architecture and nice food and drink and nice, sometimes, people. Don't get me wrong, I also like going out into nature, somewhere with a bit more greenery and less light pollution. I like going out and roaming around a little bit. But I'm also the first to admit that I am not someone who should be left alone in the countryside for an extended period of time. Not because I'll get up to anything nefarious, but because I will probably die. And it's like my brain knows this, because there's always a part of me that's happy to come back. There's a really fucked up part of my brain that genuinely misses being able to see the skyscrapers. And on the statistics, other people seem to feel the same way. Australia is one of the most urbanised nations to ever exist. Over 90% of Australians live in cities, and over 40% live in either Sydney or Melbourne, both of which have over 5 million people. That's extreme by international standards. In the entire UK, only London is bigger than either Sydney or Melbourne. If the US was organised like Australia, both New York and LA would have 70 million people each. That doesn't seem particularly feasible. So we win down here. We pack in a bit more easily than the gun humpers. How good. We are still part of a global trend though. More than half of the world now lives in cities. In high income countries, it's over 80%. And a lot of this shift has happened in just the last 200 years. As agriculture became more productive, fewer people were needed on farms. More people were free to move to the areas where jobs and ideas and people and infrastructure were already concentrating. Cities. And the reason we move to cities is obvious. They give us connections and opportunities and jobs and meaning and fun things to do. And like I've mentioned, there aren't many places where this has happened more comprehensively than Australia. But do those benefits extend to where we are now, with 40% of the population packed into just 2 cities? Especially given the increasingly clear downsides. The infrastructure strains, the travel times, the housing crises, and the general increase in anger being displayed at our fellow travellers. Would we be better off if that population of over 10 million people, instead of being spread across 2 cities, was spread across 10 mid-sized cities? Why do we endlessly pack into Sydney and Melbourne and the other capitals and not Geelong or Albury or Wagga Wagga? Why haven't more of us gone there? Why is Australia so skewed towards the megacity? Why do Sydney and Melbourne consume everything? Australia's changing, just like it always has been. For tens of thousands of years before the Europeans arrived, Indigenous Australians were shaping this continent deliberately. Populations were dispersed and mobile and adapted to place. Economic life was embedded within country. That system wasn't static, but it was balanced. And European settlement threw off that balance immediately. The early colonial period carries a legacy of rural imaginings. Young men chasing feral horses down steep hills, drovers' wives killing snakes, bushrangers murdering police officers. That world definitely existed, but it was actually never the main game. The main game was a handful of coastal outposts, imposed rapidly and designed for extraction and export rather than internal trade and development. Sydney was the first settlement, but it was never just a town. It was the first penal colony, the seat of government, military command, trade, logistics and finance all at once. Administrators, suppliers, merchants and skilled labour were all concentrated there by design. Not because they loved congestion, but because concentrating capital in one spot made sense in a small dispersed colony. Melbourne's rise was even more dramatic. Before the 1850s, it was pretty modest. Then gold was discovered in Victoria, and Melbourne's population more than doubled in under a decade. Capital poured in from Britain. Banks, insurers, shipping firms and merchants concentrated where the money was moving fastest, and where the ports, custom houses and infrastructure was already starting to develop. Early trends such as these tend to persist over time. Economists call this path dependence. And even while much of the population was still working the land, ring-barking trees, raising livestock, extracting resources, the fruits of those labours almost always flowed back to the coastal capitals. Australia's institutions, money and influence were always disproportionately concentrated in the megacity. And it was only a matter of time, really, before most of the population followed. And from the end of World War II, this happened in full. First, agriculture and mining had already become more efficient, meaning fewer people were needed to stay behind and work on the land. More and more people were made free to pour themselves into cities' service sectors: education, healthcare, finance, administration. Second to that sectoral change, migration. Between the end of World War II and 1965, 2 million additional immigrants arrived in the country. Populate or perish was an active slogan of the government, and it's been implicit ever since. Ever since then, Australia has run a targeted migration program to expand its workforce and protect its demographic structure, bringing in people to work, to support the local ageing population, to fill labour shortages, build domestic demand, and pay tax. Migrants also, overwhelmingly, settle where jobs, housing, and existing communities already are, in big cities. So we have sectoral shifts and migration flows, each channeling a greater share of Australia's population into major cities. And these trends have been reinforced again by deliberate policy decisions determining how Australians live and move. Like the United States, Australia did something very consequential very early. It went all in on something called the car. Suburban expansion was prioritised over rail density. Motorways were faster to build, cheaper upfront, and more politically marketable than train lines. And this made it far easier to navigate internally around large cities, but far harder to navigate between them, especially in a country as large and sparse as Australia. Choosing the car over the train or something else likely impeded the cultivation of second-tier cities. The car reduced the imperative to invest in fast intercity rail that could turn those second-tier cities into genuine viable alternatives. If you're travelling between Melbourne and Sydney, you're probably either flying or driving for an entire day, and probably not stopping very much along the way. And so, instead of Newcastle or Geelong or Wollongong emerging as independent economic poles, Sydney and Melbourne absorbed the bulk of the growth. That sounds like a shame when you put it that way, doesn't it? But economically, it worked. Large cities are productivity machines. Dense labour markets raise wages. Knowledge spills faster. Infrastructure is cheaper per person. Universities and hospitals can specialise and become centres of excellence. Culture can flourish when there are more points of connection. There's a greater collaboration pool with which to make music and film and whatever media you like. And international finance, especially from overseas, knows where to go. So in a strange way, concentrating into a small group of large, influential cities allowed a small, isolated country to behave like a much larger one. So it's not like this top-heavy megacity model has failed. It is a question, though, especially today, of whether it's gone a bit far. Concentration can have a tipping point. When too many people pile too quickly into too few places, the benefits of density can start to be eaten alive by congestion and housing shortages and infrastructure bottlenecks. Housing is the clearest example. Sydney and Melbourne didn't become expensive because people love paying extortionate rent. They became expensive because population growth outstripped housing supply in areas where people want to live. And there are a lot of reasons why this happened. Everyone has a favourite. The various economic incentives encouraging investors to firehose cash into investment properties, the construction costs going up and developers making speculative decisions to build despite these higher input costs, the various incentives available to first homeowners so that they enter the market as soon as possible, and from the 1990s onward, the tightening of planning systems. Height limits, zoning controls and lengthy approval processes constrain density in the very places demand was strongest. It's not one of these, it's all of them. But for those now dependent on the opportunities only available in the megacity, there was no alternative, because Australia had never pursued things such as fast intercity rail. Regional services had declined. Public transport investment lagged population growth, and the implicit message was clear: opportunity lives in the suburbs of the capitals. As a quick comparison, Tokyo is a very different place from Sydney or Melbourne, but it's a lot bigger despite the housing being a lot more affordable. The trains are frequent and reliable, and the regional cities nearby are tightly connected to the core. Australia didn't fail in urbanising too much. It could fail, though, by not finishing the job. Sydney and Melbourne are big, loud, crowded, expensive, permanently under construction, and far too big to easily design simple policy fixes for. On the other hand, they're fun. At least, I find Melbourne fun. I think Sydney's a bit weird, but I know a lot of other people find it fun, so I'll take you at your word. Anyway, big cities let you find your thing. If you like density, diversity, and optionality, you have to go to a capital. And as the economy shifts further towards services, tech, education, creative industries, That advantage is only going to grow. These sectors thrive on proximity, deep labour markets, and the kind of accidental collaboration that you only get when people are constantly bumping into one another. I don't see this massively changing. I don't see any pathway to massively de-densifying our major cities and coaxing people out to new developments in Bendigo or Charters Towers or Cootamundra, which means we need to work very hard to keep our megacities working for the people that are there now and for the people that are going to come next. More housing where people actually want to live. Serious public transport investment, gradually adjusting to the idea that we might not need to use our cars all the time, and treating density as an advantage rather than a threat. If Tokyo or Seoul or Paris can each house more people than either Sydney or Melbourne without collapsing into dysfunction, then size clearly isn't the binding constraint. The corollary, though, is that even if Sydney and Melbourne become perfectly livable megacities, Australia still needs strong growing regions, and better connectivity is the key lever. Fast frequent rail shrinks distance. It turns second-tier cities into viable, connected labour markets rather than commuter towns. We have seen flashes of this already. We have seen places where this has kind of started to work. Newcastle's post-steel diversification into health and education and services. Geelong's growth around advanced manufacturing and Deakin University. And there are national benefits too, no matter where you live. Diversification reduces exposure to housing cycles in a handful of major city postcodes. It lowers infrastructure pressure in capitals, and it makes Australia less vulnerable to urban-specific shocks. And perhaps even more importantly, second-tier cities bridge the divide between the capitals and everywhere else. As for so many countries, the cities are generally more prosperous than the regions. But too much economic divergence fuels distrust, resentment, and the sense that economic prosperity is something that happens somewhere else. From here on out, most Australians will probably keep choosing to live in major cities, and that's fine. But the regions should feel like another part of the same system, something else good, not a sacrifice. Big cities that are dense, affordable, and well connected, and regional cities that are large enough, connected enough, and dynamic enough to matter. Dynamic enough that either option is viable for someone wanting to explore something new or try something that they haven't before. The choice is what matters, because a country this big probably shouldn't feel this narrow.